In his book, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, a Japanese lieutenant shared his experience of being one of the last Japanese-born soldiers to surrender in World War II. This lieutenant had been stationed in the Philippines when it had been taken over by the U.S. forces in 1945, and almost all of his fellow soldiers were killed or captured, but he hid deep in the jungle, hiding out for 29 years. And he dismissed every attempt to coax him out of the jungle. He thought every time they tried to get him out of the jungle for 29 years, it was a trick. 29 years of not surrendering. 29 years of being away from family. 29 years of missing out on peace. 29 years of lost wages. 29 years of jungle food. For this lieutenant, his life was in tatters because he refused to surrender when surrendering was the right thing to do. Now, today we're going to take a brief peek at a general, a man who was used to victory, not used to surrendering, a general who, even though he was in a life-threatening situation, he wanted to have everything on his own terms. And what we're going to do today is we're going to trace his surrender and see how that surrender led him to actually a better life. We begin today's exploration in 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Here's verse 1. Scripture says, "Now Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper." Leprosy, or Hansen's disease, was at that time an incurable ailment that led to paralysis, eventual disfigurement, blindness, and death. In modern times, until modern times, those people with leprosy were quarantined and they were isolated. Lepers were, social outcasts and not allowed to live at home with family. And in Naaman's case, this leprosy was a slow-moving death sentence. He could anticipate having to move from his house into a leper colony, becoming completely reliant upon the kindness of others until his eventual and sad demise. Now, can you imagine the personal horror that Naaman was going through? It would be like he could say, "I've got everything a person could ever want. I'm a general, I'm respected, I'm the envy of all the men in Syria, but life is going downhill fast." Have you ever heard the phrase, somebody's going through the ringer? Have you ever been to one of those manual car washes that used the ringer? Where you were drying off your wet car and the towel got wet, and then you'd have to try to wring the towel out, and eventually you wring it out by hand, but then you look at it, it's still not usable. It's not going to dry off your car. But if you were to take that towel over to the wringer, put it in the wringer, and wring it out, it would remove a lot of water because of the incredible pressure it puts on the object going through. Naaman is a general. He's a hero. He's respected by the king of Syria. But none of that was going to cure him of leprosy. And what we're about to discover in this passage is how a successful person got help from God. To be healed, Naaman would have to go through the ringer of surrender. You see, after a career really characterized by winning battle after battle, Naaman is going to have to learn how to surrender. And not just once. He's going to have to learn to surrender twice. Now, verse 3 tells us that Naaman's wife had a young Jewish maid. Here is verse 3. Scripture says, "Then she said to her mistress, 'If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy.'" And the prophet she's referring to is Elisha. Now again, remember, Naaman is a big shot. He's a warrior, he's a leader, he's respected by the king, and he's faced with this incredible decision, a choice, in fact, a choice that will impact his life and his family probably for generations. And here's the choice that he has. He can either die of leprosy, or he can surrender to a slave girl's recommendation. Now, Naaman wasn't in the practice of taking recommendations unless it was from the king. But now he's got to choose between death and taking advice of a little slave girl. Remember, even with this, he's got no guarantee that this little girl knows what she's talking about. There's no CDC study to rely on. It's really just hearsay. And he really just has to surrender. Now, can you imagine Naaman, this kid telling his wife about this prophet out in Samaria? Naaman can't just get on a horse and go across the border into Israel without permission. So Naaman went to the king, his king, and he asked permission, and he got approval for a leave of absence. Now, the king didn't want his general to be denied at the border, so the king loaded Naaman up with silver and gold and clothing to give away to Israel's king. And after some delay, Scripture tells us that Elisha hears about Naaman's request. And Elisha, in verse 8, he states this. He says, "Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Now, on the surface, Elisha's words can seem a little bit braggadocious. But what we need to remember is that Elisha became a thorn in the side to the Syrian army. Oftentimes what would happen is that Yahweh would leak Syria's battle plans to Elisha, and Elisha knew their battle plans in advance. And then also, Elisha prophesied the end of Syria's stranglehold over Samaria. So Elisha's a big deal. He's not a fake. He's quite an amazing prophet. So let's pick up the account in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. Here's 9 and 10. Then Naaman went with the horses and chariots, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." Clean meaning healed. Now, nobody really sends a messenger to an army general except for Elisha. Elisha was not fond of Syria's king, and he's not really friendly with Naaman either. And you can really kind of see where Naaman's at if you notice his response in verses 11 and 12. Scripture says this, "But Naaman became furious, and he went and said, 'Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy.' And he went on and said this, 'Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, aren't they not better than all the waters in Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?' And Scripture says that he turned away and went away in a rage." And Naaman, you see, he couldn't cure himself. He first had to surrender to the advice of a little Hebrew slave girl. And now the prophet sends a messenger to the door to tell him to go away and go into the muddy Jordan and wash not once, but wash 7 times. Now, Naaman is the kind of person, because of his stature in the army, he's used to getting his own way. And now with leprosy and having to surrender, it's challenging for him. And his encounter with Elisha is actually the opposite, right? It's kind of the opposite of Jesus' encounter with the centurion. Naaman wanted everything his way, whereas the centurion, when he approached Jesus with humility. He didn't want healing for himself, he wanted healing for his servant. And the centurion simply asks that Jesus speak the word, verbalize the order, and immediately his servant would be healed. You see, the centurion was a man surrendered. And Naaman, we're learning today, is a man who is learning how to surrender. So his traveling companions are with him there at Elisha's door, and they witness his anger fit, they witness his pride, and they knew that what Elisha instructed him, though it was kind of challenging, it wasn't unreasonable. And so basically they go back to Naaman and say, Naaman, listen, come on, man, we just traveled all this way. Can't you just surrender one more time? Can't you just give the God of Israel a chance? Naaman, you've got a choice, buddy. You can either die or you can surrender. Why not surrender? Now, how many times have we been like Naaman, where there's no cure in sight, there's no answer in sight, but oftentimes aren't we too proud to surrender? Here's verse 14. Scripture says, so he went down and he dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So now we have Naaman. He's received his miracle. Listen, he was a strong man, he was a well-respected man, a powerful man, but he couldn't have created this miracle on his own. He couldn't have earned this miracle by working for it. And so it is with us, right? Jesus has offered us that which we don't deserve. Jesus has offered us that which we can't afford. And Jesus has offered us that which we cannot attain by our own hard work. Really, the only way onward, onto the pathway of healing and breakthrough for us, is the pathway of surrender. May the Lord richly bless you.